He'll be speaking on the 2012 elections. Senator Tom Davis served as Chief of Staff to Governor Mark Sanford before his election in 2009 to the South Carolina General Assembly, where he represents Senate District 46. He's worked as an attorney for Harvey and Batty in Beaufort County for the last 2 decades. And on the local level, he has served on the Beaufort County Planning Board, the Low Country Council of Governments, the Historic Beaufort Foundation, and the Beaufort Jasper Water and Sewer Authority. And let's give a hearty Greenville Tea Party welcome to Senator Tom Davis.
I want to start out by recognizing what you had to say about Marbury versus Madison, because you're absolutely right. And you know, how absurd is it that the federal government gets to define for itself what its powers are? I mean, that's essentially what Marbury versus Madison by declaring judicial review. And Chief Justice Marshall did in fact say it is the exclusive province of the Supreme Court to decide what is constitutional. So what that effectively did was pretty much gut the 10th Amendment. It gutted the federalist nature of our government. I mean, and we have a great South Carolinian who really fought back against that and who I've learned a lot about is John C. Calhoun. And have learned a lot about what he has to offer. One of the real intellectual founding fathers along with Jefferson and Madison. And so I'm glad you made that observation when Bill was talking, because that's not talked about enough. I want to talk a little bit about, if I can, what we need to accomplish in the 2013 legislative session in Columbia. But before I do that, or as a backdrop to analyzing what we have to do in Columbia next year and the years after that, I've taken to talking about what's going on in Washington, D.C., because it really provides the context within which we have to act. Now, we already know that we have a $16 trillion debt. We know that we've now got 4 years in a row of trillion-dollar-plus deficits. We know that we have no budget been passed in over 3 years. Recent estimates have also told us that our unfunded entitlements are around $70 trillion if you look at the present value. And so I'm looking at all that, and I'm looking at what Washington, D.C. Has wrought. But then I also consider the situation is actually far worse than those figures. Because in the last 3 years, the way we have paid for that national debt and the way that we have made up the $1 trillion annual deficit between revenues collected and appropriations made has been by printing new money, by creating new money out of thin air. And actually, in the last 3 years, the Federal Reserve has tripled our monetary base. I mean, there is 3 times the amount of currency now in the economy than there was 3 years ago. And that's truly scary. I mean, when you see the Treasury each week goes out and sells its securities and to raise money, because it needs to pay the debt, it needs to pay interest on the debt, it needs to make up the difference in the appropriations against revenues collected. And so it sells these Treasury securities, majority now, to not China, not Japan, but they sell them to primary dealers like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, who in turn then sell them to the Federal Reserve, who buys those securities by printing money, by keeping those printing presses running. And so when you stop and you look at that, you realize that the problem just isn't fiscal policy in Washington, D.C., and the deficits, and the debt, and the entitlements. It's also the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve that is financing that profligate spending and financing that profligate welfare state. And you actually, it's even worse than that, because this Federal Reserve, under Ben Bernanke, not only prints money to buy Treasury securities, to finance deficit spending and to finance our debt and dilute our savings, he also, for the first time in history, the first time in the Fed's history, its infamous history, prints money to buy toxic assets from Wall Street banks like J.P. Morgan and AIG and Goldman Sachs. I mean, institutions that engage in reckless lending and engage in reckless behavior and have bad assets on their books. They have mortgage assets where the collateral is greatly below the face amount of the note that it secures. And what the Federal Reserve has done is it's printed new money and gone out there and bought at par those toxic securities. And so not only is that cronyism of the worst form, I mean, not only is that against everything that we've learned as Americans, which is, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, that's why we had a constitution that separated power into different branches and had checks and balances. We didn't want power reposed in one entity or one person. And yet here we are tolerating the Federal Reserve that is creating money out of thin air and buying toxic assets from financial institutions that have cozy relationships with the Federal Reserve governors. That is absolutely disgusting to me. I mean, it's corrupt, and I think it needs to be called that. And so I say all that to say this, is I see that happening in Washington, D.C., and I see the $16 trillion debt, and I see the $1 trillion deficits, and I see the entitlement spending, and I see the Federal Reserve eroding our savings. What that signals to me is that in the very near future, I don't know if it's 2, 3, 4 years from now, but states are inevitably, it's a financial certainty, states inevitably are going to have to do a lot more for their citizens with a lot less money coming from Washington, D.C. That's a reality that's going to hit us like a brick wall sooner or later. That spigot is going to turn off. We're not going to get money to the degree we have in the past for roads, for schools, for health care. Because I can tell you, when they finally go ahead and do something in D.C., they'll be forced to do it, by the way. They won't do it voluntarily, they won't do it proactively, they'll do it reactively. But when they finally turn that spigot off, the cuts are going to be in terms of the money sent back down to the states. Our money that we send up there, and it sends back down to us, it's no longer going to come back down to us in that same way. And so what that means is certain states are going to fail. California, Illinois, New York. States that have thrived and depended upon federal money are going to fail. Because what's going to happen is they're going to have to raise taxes, and that's going to further drive income producers and entrepreneurs out of those states into other environments. And I want South Carolina to be one of the places where those individuals go. And so what we need to do right now, while we have a window of opportunity, while we see this happening, while we can see the train wreck coming, and I'm convinced of it, and it's not a Republican or a Democrat thing, they're both complicit in this, but I can see it coming. There's going to come a time when states are going to have to do more for their citizens with less money. So what can we do as South Carolinians, what can we do as legislators up in Columbia on your behalf to make sure South Carolina is a state where people want to come, where they want to bring their money and their families and start businesses? How can we make South Carolina that place? Well, the very first thing we can do is make sure we have a tax code that welcomes entrepreneurs and that welcomes capital investment, welcomes risk takers and people that create wealth, and welcomes their capital and their investment. And how do we do that? Well, there are 3 ways that taxes are raised in South Carolina for local and state government. You have the income tax and the corporate tax, which is a tax on wealth creation. You have the property tax, which is a tax on capital investment. And you have a consumption tax, or a sales tax. And in terms of being a state that welcomes entrepreneurs and welcomes private capital, not all taxes are equal in terms of their impact on that. The most damaging is the income tax. The most damaging is the tax on those who come in and take risks, create jobs, and seek to prosper. And so what is our income tax in South Carolina? Well, we have a top marginal rate of 7%. That's the highest in the Southeast. Worse still, that top marginal rate of 7% kicks in at $14,000. Most states have a top marginal rate that kicks in at $50,000 or $60,000 or $70,000. Ours kicks in at $14,000. So not only do we have a high top marginal income tax rate, it kicks in at a very low threshold. So every dollar you make above $14,000 is taxed at that top marginal rate, effectively the highest in the nation. So if you're somebody in California or New York and Illinois and you finally had enough, and you can't suffer the taxes any longer, you can't suffer the regulatory burdens, you want to pick up and go someplace else, you're not going to look at South Carolina because of that income tax. You're not going to be a startup company or an entrepreneur and come to South Carolina. We have to fix that. The second thing is capital investment. That's the second most important thing. And in South Carolina, we have the highest manufacturing and industrial property taxes in the nation. 10.5% assessment ratio. So if you're a corporation or a company or an individual coming to South Carolina and investing your capital, You're going to be taxed on the assessed value of that improvement times 10.5% times the millage rate of that county. Okay, and that is extremely punitive. Now, if you're a large corporation, if you're a BMW or a Michelin or a Boeing, you can negotiate around that. You've got the political clout to go to a county council and say, I want to pay taxes on a fee in lieu of tax basis. I don't want to have an assessed value. I want to have a contract with the county and pay taxes that way. And so they can mitigate that oppressive tax burden, and that's why they come here. But if you're a small or a mid-cap company, or if you're an entrepreneur or a mom-and-pop shop, you're not going to come to South Carolina and make that investment and not only pay that high assessment tax ratio, but in South Carolina, you pay the school property taxes. We've taken that off 4% and put it on 6% and 10.5% properties. So we're very punitive in South Carolina right now when it comes to taxes on wealth creation and entrepreneurs and taxes on private investment. Now, where we're relatively lax, and I say relatively because all taxes are a form of theft, I think, and all taxes impede economic development. But in terms of relative impact on the economy, the least damaging is a consumption tax or a sales tax, which is paid by everybody across the board. And then here in South Carolina, we have a sales tax that is absolutely riddled with loopholes and exemptions and special favors, over 100 of them. We exempt more in sales taxes than we collect. Last year we exempted $2.7 billion worth of sales taxes and collected $2.1 billion. So what we need to do is we need to sunset the sales tax exemptions, say that as of a date certain, every single sales tax exemption is going to be sunset unless the holder of that exemption can come forward and demonstrate to the majority of the House and the majority of the Senate that somehow that exemption still serves a compelling state interest and ought to be maintained. But if they can't make that case by a date certain, then they sunset. Now, some will make that case. I think there should be a sales tax exemption, for instance, on the sale of food and on the sale of medicine. So certain of those are going to meet that test, but most will not. The revenue that's yielded by sunsetting those exemptions should be used to lower the taxes on manufacturing, industrial, and commercial property, and lower taxes on that top marginal rate of 7%, and to increase the threshold at which that top marginal rate is triggered, so that you then have a tax code that when individuals look at South Carolina, they see a state that welcomes entrepreneurs. They see a state that welcomes private capital. And if we do that, we're going to be the beneficiary of a lot of states who have been too profligate in the past and who are going to lose their wealth creators. So I want to make South Carolina that place. So that's one thing I want to accomplish in 2013 in the General Assembly. The second thing I want to accomplish is, and this gets back to the comment I made earlier about John C. Calhoun and the 10th Amendment, I want South Carolina, along with other states, to pick up its burden to fight back against federal encroachment. Amen. The problem right now is we have sat back, states have sat back, and they've complained, and they've looked at Washington, D.C., and they've hoped that our leaders up there will go ahead and rein in spending. They've hoped that they'd lower taxes. They've hoped that they'd stop the encroachment on our individual liberties in the areas of education and in terms of health care. But you know what? Just hoping and wishing our elected officials, and we've got some great elected officials up there, quite frankly. Mick Mulvaney, Jeff Duncan, Trey Gowdy, Tim Scott. I mean, these guys are fighting the fight up there, and I'm proud of them. But we have a job in Columbia. We have a job as state senators because the checks and balances that our founding fathers put in the Constitution to guard against tyranny aren't simply horizontal checks and balances with the three branches of government, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. Those are checks and balances we all heard about in grade school, and that they are important. But there's also vertical checks and balances through federalism. And we have to remember that the states were sovereign. And they went ahead and formed a compact and gave certain limited and enumerated powers to the federal government. And if they didn't have those powers given away, they didn't have them. And they weren't satisfied with just that. They passed in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, that said any power that's not in this federal Constitution, any specific power that's not enumerated and given, is retained under the states and the people respectively. And that 10th Amendment is not a dead letter. That 10th Amendment is an empowering amendment. It is a recognition of the fact that states are sovereign and that sovereign states have a duty to their constituents and to their citizens to fight back and to push back through nullification and through other mechanisms whenever encroachments occur. And we haven't been doing that. We have been sitting back, and we have actually been complicit in that we've gone ahead and taken federal dollars that have strings attached to them, that we know encroach upon our sovereignty, that we know limit our freedoms, but we've taken that money anyway because we were greedy and we wanted it. We went ahead and took the money over your liberties and your freedom. We have to stop doing that. We have to go ahead and stop taking dollars from the federal government that have strings, and we need to be aggressive, along with our sister states, in pushing back and passing nullification provisions that say, if we believe that a federal law oversteps the authority that we, the sovereign states, gave you, we are not going to enforce it within our borders. And now what you hear, all the time in Columbia is that, oh, Tom, and, Senator Evans, if we do that, we're buying a lawsuit. To which I say, so what? Get in there, push the envelope, push back, go ahead and declare these federal acts unconstitutional, and make them bring a lawsuit against you. Go into court and make your case. Articulate why you did what you did. Get your sister states to join in with you because they're pushing back as well. There are things that we can do that we're not doing. So that's the second thing I want to do up in Columbia in 2013. The first is to make South Carolina the freest state, that makes it welcoming to entrepreneurs, that says our doors are open. If you want to come here and you have an idea and you have capital and you want to invest, you can reap the rewards of your labor, and we're not going to overtax you on your capital investment. I want to be that state. And the second thing I want to do is to be the state that leads the way in pushing back, because there are vertical checks and balances, and the states haven't been doing their share. They've been sitting back since the New Deal, quite frankly, and taking it time and time and time again. And so those are the two most important things I want to accomplish next session. Yes, sir.
Tom, listen, we do have a precedent. When J.C. Calhoun was Vice President of the United States with Andrew Jackson in 1824, he told Jackson that this taxation thing for the South is an abomination. He resigned as Vice President of the United States, came back, and we did not have the 17th Amendment then. He was then appointed a senator from South Carolina. And he fought all of these taxes in 1828 and 1832 and moral tariff. We need people who know what the heck's going on that are going to speak, like you. You'd be good.
Another good example, sir, is with Jefferson and Madison when the Sedition Acts were passed. That actually the Federalists passed this. That said it was a crime for anybody to criticize or speak ill of the national government. And Jefferson and Madison drafted a resolution, a nullification resolution, that was passed by the Virginia Assembly, which nullified that and said, we are not going to respect that law within our borders because that is violative of the First Amendment, that oversteps the authority you have, that we gave you as a federal government, and we're not going to acknowledge it. I don't know why sovereign states, and that's what we are, sovereign states. We're not political subdivisions for the federal government. It's the other way around. The federal government is our agent. We gave them powers to do things for us, and to the extent that they're not doing it, or if they're overstepping the authority we gave them, we have a duty to push back. And quite frankly, we have been derelict as state legislators in not enforcing those particular powers, because checks and balances only work when you exert them. To have them in theory or to have them on paper is useless. And let me just say one other thing, and I'll take another question. The thing I've come to realize, and I had this all wrong in law school, I used to think that the Republican Party and the Party of Limited Government and the Party of Individual Liberty traced its roots back to the Federalists, to Hamilton, to Washington, to John Marshall, because I saw them as maybe, the Federalists were like the Republicans of today. In reality, those that believe in individual liberty and those that believe in a limited state and those that believe in federalism are actually people like Jefferson and John C. Calhoun. I mean, Democrats. I mean, so things are all topsy-turvy. And we have to realize, and I realize that now, and I'm ashamed to say that years ago I didn't, but I get it now. And I'm extremely proud of the fact of our history in South Carolina. I'm extremely proud of the fact that South Carolina has historically been the one to push back against the federal government. I'm extremely proud of people like John C. Calhoun. And so we need now, in this time of crisis in our country, to go ahead and be those patriots again in state legislators and start leading those battles that our forefathers did. So that is an excellent point, and we have to understand our history better. Yes, sir.
What's the environment like in Columbia when you bring these ideas forward to attract?
A lot of them, and look, I mean, you guys up here have two really good, solid guys in Lee Bright and Shane Martin, excuse me, who really fight that battle, and so does Kevin Bryant, and so do some others. But I got to tell you, a lot of them, when we speak like this from the podium and we talk about this and when we push legislation, they roll their eyes and they say, well, there they go again, and because they see us as being uncivilized or unsophisticated, and we don't understand the nuances of constitutional law. And don't you realize that the supremacy clause in the federal Constitution is the supreme law of the land? And I'm like, well, I understand that, but that's only in regard to those specific areas in which they've been authorized to act. It doesn't mean that everything that they do we have to bow down and accept. And quite frankly, not enough legislators up there understand the history, understand what their responsibility is, understand the overreach by the federal government, and don't understand what powers we have to push back. And so to be frank with you, I wish there were more people that would stand up here and say these sorts of things, but there aren't. I'm hoping that it's growing. And the reason why I go around the state, the reason why I drive 4 hours up here to talk to you, is because you guys are willing to hear it and you guys are willing to do something about it. I was in Spartanburg the week before last. I was in Aiken before that, Myrtle Beach before that, Lancaster just the other day. Saying these same things, because until the people demand it from the outside of your legislators, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen simply inside those walls. It's going to take the people demanding that it happen. You'll follow.
Specifically, when you bring up the idea of attracting, you spoke about at the beginning of your speech, attracting
being the freest state in the nation, being the state that recognizes entrepreneurs and welcomes capital.
The states that will fall and want and have people that will leave and making us an attractive place to come to. How are they receiving that message?
They don't receive that well at all, because what they see as a way to promote economic growth and development is to go ahead and pass special incentives and grants and subsidies. I mean, they feel like they have the ability, for some reason they become vested with magical investment power when they're elected. They want to go ahead and look down the road and see, okay, what are the emerging industries and clusters? That's the word they like to use. What new cluster is going to happen, and how can we nurture it? And who can we give special subsidies and grants and tax breaks to? I mean, it's a top-down model, just like the Soviet Union. And let me give you an idea of just how pervasive it is. In 1998, we gave away $34 million into the special grants and subsidies to corporations and whatnot. 14 years later, we're now up to over $1 billion a year that we give away. And you would think that if they want to act like investment brokers up there, they would at least do their due diligence on the front end, and then on the back end give an accounting back to you, the taxpayer, as to what you got with the money. They do neither. On the front end, in terms of due diligence, they do nothing whatsoever. What they do is, they look and see who the lobbyist is that's been hired. The lobbyist goes to the Senate Finance Chairman and the House Ways and Means Chairman. They get a tax break and a subsidy put in the code, and there it is. And so there it sits. And then afterwards, there's no accounting back to anybody as to what did we buy by giving them this tax break? What did we buy by giving them this subsidy? And you guys are buying it, because for every special break that's given away, you guys pay higher taxes. And we don't have any due diligence on the front end and no transparency in the back end, because what they love doing is they love the ribbon cutting ceremonies. They love to stand there by a new building with a ribbon out front with the 15 new employees that are being hired, and they cut that ribbon and they're on the front page of the paper, and that's very visible, and they can see, look what I did, I created jobs. What you're not seeing are the businesses that are going under, and the people that can't survive because of the tax burden they have to bear because of the favors that the politicians have given to those with access. And so, no, they're not receptive to it. And why in the world, here we are in the year 2012, we have to defend free markets. We have to defend capitalism. We have to defend the marketplace as being the logical way that winners and losers are sorted out. And that's somehow radical, and that's somehow, not enlightened. And to be enlightened, you have to be one of these philosopher kings that sits back and thinks we can know what's going to happen 5, 10 years from now, and let's shower favors on those. It's completely backwards, but that's the prevailing wisdom among Republicans and Democrats alike up there.
2 more questions, please.
I wanted to make the point also that what you're talking about at the state level also needs to be done by us at the county level.
Absolutely.
And I want to give you one of the best examples of being able to push back against the federal government from the very county level. If anybody can remember the Sheriff Mack and Sheriff Prince against the Brady bill during the Clinton administration, they won that case to get at least portions, I can't remember if it was the whole Brady bill or portions of the Brady bill, declared unconstitutional during the Clinton administration. That was a county sheriff or several county sheriffs that bonded together. I think that's a great example.
How strong, how prosperous would we be as a state if we had the reputation as being the state that fights back against who takes our liberties, who doesn't take it when somebody tries to usurp their liberty, and a state that has low taxes across the board for everybody, that isn't dependent upon who has the power to buy access? I mean, how prosperous would we be if we had that rep as a state? People would want to come here. They'd want to come here because that's a place where anybody can flourish if they work hard enough. That's what we have to adopt as a state. We have to have that in it.
We're where we are largely by acquiescence.
We are, and it's like that's what I said before. A check and balance is useless unless you use it. Yes,
Senator Davis, I appreciate talking about principle nullification. I believe, just like Jefferson said, it's the rightful remedy in the federal tyranny that's coming at us. Right here in my hands, I have a 2.5-page document of the Missouri bill nullification that passed their House, and the Senate had a measure of due pass before the session ended. They're going to pass it. It makes it a criminal offense for any federal bureaucrat to step into the state of Missouri and try to enforce Obamacare. Sure, we'll arrest you. And I think talked about making South Carolina attractive, not being under the 130 new bureaucracies that are created in Obamacare. Imagine the job boom and the housing boom that would take place in our state if we weren't under that tyranny. Would you consider this to be a priority that South Carolina would follow suit?
absolutely.
The next legislature.
Absolutely. That's why I said that the two things my two overarching objectives in next session is to make South Carolina the freest state in the nation that welcomes entrepreneurs and investment private capital. That's one. Second of all, I want South Carolina to be a leader in pushing back against federal encroachment. That includes multiplication, that includes rejecting money that has strings attached to it, it includes a whole lot of things, and if it involves us being in federal court, we've got an Attorney General, Alan Wilson, who's willing to fight that battle, and I can't think of a better way to spend tax dollars than to fight for your liberties and against encroaching federal government.
Is it possible, or has anybody modeled the revenue expected if you offset the income tax rates by sunsetting the exemptions and assumed a certain growth rate as a result? In other words, these favors that have been given to the big companies, Boeing, BMW, whoever else has got them, Michelin, I assume way back. Do we have a model to see what the revenue would be with some kind of an assumed growth rate?
I don't have one. I don't have.
I think that's what you're going to need
model.
to do.
But you're right, to empirically make your case, against those that are going to say, well, if you stop giving these subsidies, then you're going to have corporations not come here. What you're going to have to demonstrate is that by lowering taxes for everybody, and with the capital that brings in, and the other entrepreneurs that brings in, and have a dynamic analysis, what they call dynamic analysis, that you're going to more than make up. But let me give you,
see, everybody assumes a static model, even Romney last
That's right.
failed to say this is not static. There's
right,
increasing base upon which
it's somewhat counterintuitive, but not really, that if you lower taxes, you're going to increase taxes because you spur growth, and that spur growth, of course, generates revenues for government.
It's a form of pricing.
But I will say this, anecdotally, when I talked about in 1998, we gave away $34 million in these special breaks, and that's escalated over the last 14 years to over $1 billion a year now. We used to have a average per capita income that was 89% of the national average, 14 years ago. Now it's 82% of the national average. And we have seen our unemployment rate, which used to be right about in the middle of the pack, go down to we're fourth or fifth worst in the nation now. So we've tried this, steering dollars to particular corporations. We've tried this top-down approach. We've tried showering favors. It hadn't worked.
That's picking winners and losers.
That's right. What we need to do is go back to what what used to be common sense, which was the marketplace will allocate capital, and capital will go to those that offer a product at a good price, and that's the company that should prosper. Let capital be allocated that way. Let's not allocate capital based on what 170 politicians decide what's going to be popular 10 years from now. So in any event, thank you all for inviting me up here. I think it's my second time.